Hey, church family, I wanted to take this opportunity to present you with another word of encouragement as we continue to pray for the recovery of our country. Now, it was last week when I shared some good news about the second wave of the coronavirus, which is taking place over in Europe. That might sound strange to refer to this as good news. But listen, the fact is this, that the case rate, while it's steadily increasing, it's also true that the fatality rate remains extremely low. And it's for this reason that many experts are beginning to believe that the virus is growing weaker and weaker over time. Some scientists insist that the drop in death rates could be partly due to a mutation of the coronavirus. Now, you might not know this, but many viruses tend to become less deadly over time. And one reason why is because they need a living host to survive. According to one group of experts from the University of Oxford, they put out this statement that the proportion of people infected by the coronavirus who later died was certainly lower in early August than it was in late June. They go on to say, over the period, this infection fatality rate dropped by between 55 and 80%. Now consider that. That's huge. Jason Oak from the University of Oxford also declared this. He says, this doesn't seem to be the same disease or as lethal as it was earlier when we saw huge numbers of people dying. Or to sum it up with simplicity, the second wave that's taking place there in Europe is far less deadly than the first wave, and by upwards of 80%. That's great news. I would also direct your attention to a study out of Tokyo, which helps us to see that the spread of this virus is much more prevalent than once understood, and therefore far less deadly than we ever imagined. At the beginning of this study that I'm referring to, 615 adults in Tokyo were given antibody tests to see if they had already been infected. At that point in time, the antibody test revealed that 6% of those in the group already had antibodies, which indicated previous exposure to the virus. The group was then tested again in the middle of summer, and here's what they discovered. They found that 47% of them were testing positive for antibodies, or in other words, over 40% of the subjects had been infected with the Rona since the beginning of the study, or since the start of the study. They had been infected since then. I'm sure that we're not surprised to learn that the case rate of this group increased over time. That's what we would expect. But what's interesting about this is that there were no mandatory lockdowns in Japan. None of these people were locked down. They weren't forced to wear masks, and so the infection rate spread. And yet at the same time, listen, not one person from the study was hospitalized. Not one of them died. And with that being the case, I can't help but to wonder, how many of us here in America have also already been infected, and we never even knew it. We never had symptoms. We never struggled and needed hospitalizations. As we consider that study in Japan, we have to ask these questions about what's going on here in America. According to one report, CDC officials believe that our national infection levels are as much as 10 times higher than those revealed through testing. This estimate is based on a few factors, including the antibodies found in random blood specimens, which include those from people undergoing routine or sick visit blood work unrelated to the pandemic. And while there are those in the media who use this data in order to encourage further lockdowns, they use this data to say, there's people infected out there and you don't even know who they are. But I just encourage you to remember that the second wave of infections that occurred there in Japan, it was far less deadly than the first wave that occurred back in the beginning of this year. And a group that did this study, those who were infected never even felt the symptoms of the infection. As I consider all this data, it seems to me that the Rona is continuing to degrade as it becomes weaker and weaker over time. And while it's true that the COVID is extremely infectious, it's also true that the odds of surviving are increasingly in our favor. For example, if you're under the age of 20, you have a 99.997% chance of surviving. If you're between the ages of 20 and 49, then you have a 99.98% chance of surviving the infection. And those who are between the ages of 50 and 79, if you have no underlying conditions, now on average, you have a 99.7% chance of surviving after being infected. Simply put, the odds of surviving this virus are increasingly in our favor. They're increasingly in our favor. And while I don't mean to suggest that we should stop taking proper precautions in order to avoid infection, what I do mean to say is that we don't need to live in fear of this virus. Infection is not an automatic death sentence. And the fact is that this can be seen in the research that took place there in Japan, where we find many of the subjects in that test, they tested positive for antibodies, showing that they had been infected, and yet they never even knew that they were infected. With all this being the case, I just want to remind you once again that we don't need to live in fear of the coronavirus. The fact of the matter is this, that Christ is the Lord of our life, not COVID. Christ is the Lord of our life. Christ is in control of our life, not COVID. Therefore, submitting to the fear of the COVID, I don't do that. I encourage you instead, submit your life to Christ Jesus so that we can spend the rest of our life serving him. With this as the goal, I invite you to join us right here at Calvary South Austin for our weekly services. If you'd like to know more about our service times and the measures that we're taking to sanitize our facilities, well, you can find all this information right here at calvarysouthaustin.com. I hope to see you soon, but until I do, let's continue fighting the good fight of faith, all for the glory of God.